Hello, friends. It's Jessica from Three Rivers Homestead, and it is preservation season. We're preserving all sorts of things on the homestead, including food for the cattle here. We're having to store away hay into the barn, firewood. We're getting stocked up on that so that we can keep warm in the winter months. And then my main job right now is preserving as much food as possible for our family of 10 so that we'll have food available during the winter when the things that we like to grow on the homestead aren't necessarily available and growing fresh. So my first job in preparation for preservation season is always to head down into our pantry, which is in our cellar here, and just kind of get things cleaned up. Next week, I'll be doing an assessment to kind of see how much of certain items we're going to need to preserve this year and get canned up. But for now, I need to clean. As I send children down throughout the spring with boxes of maybe empty jars, they just kind of set them on the table here, and it's my job to come down and then organize and put things away where they go. We still have quite a bit left over from last year. You can see lots of canning jars are still on the shelves. I have several shelves that aren't shown in this video shot that are still full as well. So really an assessment is needed to just kind of see what we're set on and what we're completely out of. And then I can set some goals for this year's canning season, and I will be sure to bring you along on that video, hopefully next week, to kind of show you those assessments and what my plan is for this year's preservation season, which is just starting. So I got this table all cleaned up, which I'm going to need for the next project, which is harvesting some of our garlic here. So first I have a bed of hardneck garlic here that still has some scapes that needed to be harvested, and that hardneck garlic still looks good. Like, it's not ready to be harvested probably for another 2 or 3 weeks. But my soft neck garlic, for some reason, has just grown more quickly than the hardneck, and it has already fallen over and is mostly yellowed. You can see it here. So I decided, why not go ahead and harvest these. I had pulled a few bulbs and they were a decent size, and so I decided that it would be wise to go ahead and pull these so that this bed would become available for some other crops that I would like to plant, mainly bush beans at this point. So this soft neck variety is going to be perfect for long-term storage. We're going to cure this, and then we can braid the stalks once they're dried, and we'll be all ready to go. At the end of this bed, I had a little bit of room that I just threw some onions in there. The onions are definitely not ready for harvest, and they won't be until a little later in July. They're still looking lovely. We have 3 beds of Patterson bulb onions here besides what is shown at the end of this bed, but just doing a little work to clean up. The weeds are kind of getting ahead of me this growing season, and so it felt good to get those onions cleaned up a little bit. And you can see we're getting some nice bulbs. They're already a good size, and I think with another month or so of growth, they're going to be perfect for storage. But for now, we just pulled these soft neck garlic bulbs. I didn't grow near as much garlic this year as I did last year because I still have a lot of garlic powder that is freeze dried. I still have some frozen garlic puree, and so I just didn't need as much this year as I have in years past. But we're going to take this box downstairs to the table that I cleaned off and get this ready to cure. Curing garlic is very important for long-term storage. Basically, you're going to find a place with a temperature somewhere between maybe 45 to 65 degrees, and you're going to lay your garlic out and you're going to let it dry. This allows the paper on the garlic bulbs to dry so that nothing molds or mildews or rots, and then it will store nicely for you throughout the winter. You just want a place that is dark and dry and kind of well ventilated, and you're just going to leave your garlic there laid out for maybe a couple weeks, 2, maybe 3 weeks at the most. And then, as I mentioned, those green stalks will dry if it's a soft neck variety, and then they'll be very easy for you to braid them. And then you can have these beautiful braids of garlic, hang them up in your pantry, and then you can cut off a bulb of garlic whenever you need one throughout the winter. So hopefully by the time all of this soft neck garlic is cured, I can move this off the table, harvest my hard neck, and then get that cured as well. The garden is coming along nicely, even if it is a little messy and weedy, but we're getting lots of summer crops now starting to pop up. I harvested my first little cherry tomatoes. I've been snacking on those while I work in the garden. We harvested our first peppers, lots of cucumbers. I'm so excited. And then my potato plants, you can see they're already yellowed and dying back. It's such a strange year with this heat, and so these are ready to harvest. So I went ahead and pulled this box of potatoes. We've got some really beautiful ones in here. In this little space, I only put about maybe $7 worth of seed potato in just this small space that I'm showing here. And in this little space, I was able to grow 50 pounds here of organic potatoes, which for about $7 is a wonderful deal. I will take it. And so we have this bottom space on this table. We're also going to get these potatoes curing, just like the garlic. They'll be down here so that the skin of these can dry. And then these are the potatoes that we'll eat off of fresh for about the next month. I have a couple of raised garden beds with potatoes in them, but then once these are gone, we can harvest those, and that'll keep us in fresh potatoes this summer. Speaking of potatoes, these are the bulk potatoes that I bought from Azure Standard in the haul that I showed you a couple weeks ago that were already sprouting. I was kind of disappointed about that, and we've been eating off them for a couple weeks, but it's definitely time to preserve them. So I thought I would show you a couple preservation methods. Here's the first one for people that don't necessarily like to can food or don't like the taste of canned potatoes. A great way to preserve excess potatoes is to make your own frozen French fries. Just like the convenience food that you can buy in the grocery store, you can make a little bit of a healthier homemade version of those. So I just peeled the spots on my potatoes where the sprouts were, and then I have this nifty little crinkle cut slicer that I'll link in the video description for you. It's very cheap, just a little handy tool that you can cut perfect little crinkle fry shapes. And as we cut those fries, we're making sure to soak them in a bowl of cool water. That will prevent those potatoes from turning gray while you're cutting up the rest of them. And then the soaking will also eliminate some of the excess starch that's in those potatoes before we get to preserving them. So there are a couple ways to do this. The first thing that you can do is drain that soaking water, and then you're going to cover all of your little cut French fries in some oil. We're using olive oil. You can use whatever oil you like. And we're just going to mix this around. And then we are going to spread all of these fries out onto some baking sheets that have been lined with parchment paper. And then we'll sprinkle them with salt and then get them in the oven to bake. However you decide to preserve these potatoes, they do need to be cooked a little bit before they're frozen to prevent them from turning to mush. So another option, if you don't want to bake them, would be to blanch them. So you would boil water for about 2 to 5 minutes and drop your little fries into the water, and then immediately take them out of the boiling water and shock them with ice water. And then you could go ahead and freeze them, bag them up and freeze them. But I think baking is just a lot easier. It's less messy, less work. So we just sprinkle with salt, put them in the oven on maybe 350, 400 degrees for 20 minutes or so. You just want those potatoes to be thoroughly cooked through, maybe slightly browned. Then we're going to let them completely cool before we flash freeze them. This is the first step. We don't want to just toss those cooked fries into a bag, or they're going to clump up and be really hard to use when we want to pull them out of the freezer. So flash freezing is just putting them in a single layer on some kind of tray. I'm using my freeze dryer trays because they have these nifty covers for them. And in that single layer, we're going to put them in the freezer for just a few hours until they're kind of frozen through. And then we can transfer them to bags for long-term storage. If you don't have a vacuum sealer, just a standard, maybe gallon-sized Ziploc bag would work for long-term storage, but because we do have a vacuum sealer, this is how I prefer to freeze a lot of my things. It just prevents freezer burn and I think keeps things fresher a little bit longer. So we're removing that single layer of flash frozen potatoes, and then putting them into our vacuum sealer bags here. And then if you've never seen one of these, how it works is you stick it in the machine and it will vacuum out all of the excess air and then seal the bag for you. And then you have what looks like store-bought frozen French fries. When we want to use these, all we have to do is take them directly frozen. You don't want to thaw them first. Take them frozen and we can deep fry them. We could put them in an air fryer. We could bake them however we want to cook them up, and we pretty much have some instant French fries. And they're a lot healthier than what we could get in the store. This was a really easy way to preserve the excess potatoes that we're sprouting, and I think we will enjoy these French fries throughout the rest of the summer when we have like hamburger meals and we're grilling out meat. So that's just one way that I preserve those potatoes. My other favorite way is obviously canning. You guys know I love to can food. Canned potatoes, my favorite way to use canned potatoes is in potato salad. I also like to fry the canned potatoes up for easy, quick breakfasts. But this batch of canned potatoes I'm going to use for beef stew. We are at a point where our family doesn't need individual quart jars with all of the ingredients in the beef stew put together in the jar. We will have a jar of potatoes, a separate jar of carrots, a separate jar of stew meat, and maybe a jar of onion broth, and we'll put all that together and it'll give us a gallon of soup. So I have 7 quart jars here. I'm just chopping up my peeled potatoes into the jars, and then we're going to prepare them for canning. So it's really simple. All we have is the potatoes in the jar, and then we are just going to top them with water, just room temperature water, straight out of our tap. We have well water, so I feel safe canning with that. And we're trying to leave an inch headspace. So these chunks of potatoes do have the potential to leave kind of gaps of air in between them. So it really is important that you get something like a chopstick out and you debubble those jars to make any trapped air rise to the top. This is important so that you can then readjust the headspace to try to maintain that 1 inch between the top of the jar and the water line. Now that our jars are filled and the water is adjusted, we can add our lids. I'm using my 4 jars canning lids, and they are having a great sale this week that you can learn about in the video description. If you use my code in this coming week, you can buy 1 set of lids and get the second one 50% off, which is an amazing deal, especially with canning season coming up. It's important to stock up on those lids before, maybe they sell out. And what better time to stock up than when there's a buy one, get one 50% off sale. So make sure you check out the video description, use my coupon code, and you can save on some lids. So canned potatoes, this is literally one of the easiest things you can pressure can. It's as simple as filling the jars with potatoes, covering them with water, and then getting them into the pressure canner. We can fit 7 quarts in my simple Presto canner here, put some water in there, and then we're going to get the lid on and get this on the stove. Now for quarts of potatoes, they are going to process for 40 minutes, and the pressure that you're going to use is just going to depend on the elevation at which you live. So you're going to need to consult or look at a canning guide to make sure that you're using the appropriate pressure. We use 11 psi here. If you're doing pints of potatoes, you would only process them for 35 minutes. And when you're done, you have some wonderful shelf-stable potatoes that we will be using for beef stew. Now, since I was thinking about beef stew, I decided to pull some stew meat out of the freezer and go ahead and can up a batch of that. What I'm starting with is garlic scapes because that's what we have available fresh. If we didn't have scapes, I would use bulbs of garlic, but we're just going to use the garlic scapes. This is a milder garlic flavor, and I'm just chopping up what I had harvested that day from the garden and then dividing that amount amongst my 6 quart jars that I have here. And then we're using green onions for the same reason. I haven't harvested onion bulbs, but the green onions will work just fine, and then we're going to separate those amongst the jars as well. And then I'm putting 2 bay leaves per jar. I'm going to wait, and the rest of my herbs that I would normally put in my beef stew, we will add at the time that we are putting the stew together and emptying jars, just because I haven't harvested a lot of those herbs yet this year. And then we are going to add 1 teaspoon of salt per jar. That seems like a lot, but when you think about in total, we're going to have a gallon of different jars put into the pot. 1 teaspoon of salt isn't going to go that far, and we will probably need to add more when we're putting the stew together. And then here is my homegrown beef. Happy to get this out of the freezer and make some room for everything else that we're going to be putting in the freezer this year. Just dividing that meat amongst these jars to make sure that they are nice and full. And then just like with the potatoes, we're going to top the jars off with some room temperature water. We also are going to try to maintain that 1-inch headspace with these stew meat jars, debubbling because this meat can trap air just like the potatoes did. I did need to adjust some of the headspace after some of those air bubbles came up. And then we are wiping the rims of these jars because that meat can be greasy, and any grease that could be on the rim of that jar would affect a seal, and you don't want to have a seal failure with this precious homegrown meat. That would definitely not be ideal. Once again, putting our lids on, and make sure you check out the video description to get your discount on lids. So anytime that we are canning quarts of meat, it is going to process for 90 minutes in the pressure canner, which feels like an eternity, especially when you're taking the time to wait for it to come up to pressure and cooling down. It is quite a process, but it is worth it to have shelf-stable meat. I don't have to worry about losing this meat in a power outage, and it clears up room in my freezer. So that is super exciting. Just filling our canner here with the appropriate amount of water. Gonna get that canner lid on top, get it on the stove, and after it processed for 90 minutes, we have our jars of stew meat. And as I mentioned, I'll take one of these jars of meat, a jar of canned potatoes, a jar of canned carrots, and a jar of my French onion soup base, and mix that all together with some herbs. And we have a really easy lunch this winter. So super excited about that. And I'm so happy that canning season is here. I love to can food. I love squirreling things away for the winter. So I'm happy to take you guys along on that process. We're going to be doing a lot of canning over the next couple of months. Once we're done and everything has cooled down, we need to remove the rings from those lids in order to store them away. And then I have my helper Levi here making sure we get everything labeled properly. We label with what is in the jar as well as the year so that we can make sure that we're rotating everything and using the things from last year before we start cracking open jars from this year. And so then I'll have my big boys help me carry these jars downstairs, and we will get everything on the shelves organized. That's a big ordeal during canning season, is making sure that everything in the pantry stays organized because we're constantly bringing things down and bringing empty jars up. So that is the next project. I had promised you guys in probably last month that I would show you the next time I changed the oil on my freeze dryer. I know when I first got a freeze dryer, I was very intimidated by the idea of an oil pump because in my mind I was thinking it would be as complicated as changing the oil on your car or something like that, and that's something I've never done, but it really is simple. There's a valve on the front that you just open up, and you tip your oil pump over and just drain the old oil here. You can see that's what I'm doing. I just drain it into a jar like this. It really is that simple. You can see that the old oil is kind of yellowed and discolored. Now they do sell a filter, so you can pour this dirty oil in through the filter and it will come out clear and clean just like new oil. And I will typically do that a couple of times with the same batch of oil, and then I feel like it's best to use a fresh batch. And so that's what I was doing on this day. Was I'm gonna go ahead and discard that old oil and add some fresh stuff. I get my oil from Harvest Right. It's just a high quality pure mineral oil. You pour that into the top here of the oil pump, and that's all you have to do. So there is a, I guess, gauge on the front of it that will show you how much oil you need to put in. You just make sure it's somewhere between that minimum and maximum. You can see my oil level is right below that maximum line. Once you get it to that point, then it's just putting the cap back on and hooking everything back up. and then you're all set to go. You only need to do this maybe every 20 batches, and your freeze dryer will let you know when it needs to be changed. So that really isn't that difficult. I like to, whenever I change the oil, just kind of do a refresh on the machine, take it apart, pull everything out, and give it a good wiping down. Now, obviously, if I was freeze drying a batch and something had spilled, I would spot clean as I need to go. But when I change the oil, it's just when I do, it's just a good reminder to like pull everything out, make sure there's no food stuck in the back that could clog up the drain where the water drains out of the machine. Just get everything nice and clean and fresh and put back together, and then you'll be good to go for another 20 batches, which this time of year that freeze dryer is running pretty much all day, every day, to make sure all of the food that we're bringing in from the garden is being preserved. That's it for this week. We'll be back next week with more exciting adventures on the homestead. Thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. All right, friends, be blessed.